impact at the moment, putting renewed pressure on hospitals. It has the second highest number of cases in Southeast Asia after Indonesia. And with one of the longest and hardest lockdowns in the world, the economic impact has been absolutely crippling. Thousands forced onto the streets in search of food. Howard Johnson reports from Manila.
I'm in the car park of a crematorium in the north of Manila. There's a queue of ambulances here. Just beyond the building, I can see a plume of smoke coming up. Apparently, they're delivering around 3 bodies a day to the crematorium. I speak with an ambulance driver.
Absolutely, they are busy because there's a lot of urn inside. That means 24 hours. They're working 24 hours.
The pressure is on in Manila's hospitals too. In the last month, bed space has been in short supply. We're just driving inside the grounds of San Lazaro Hospital, one of the main hospitals here for dealing with infectious diseases. And I can see a line for symptomatic patients. That's why we're inside the car, to maintain social distance. And behind that line is a field tent set up by UNICEF to deal with coronavirus patients. I can see one man lying on a stretcher with an oxygen tank to his right-hand side. But a second hard lockdown has seen daily new cases begin to fall, down from April's peak of 15,000 now to around 8,000 per day, according to the Department of Health. However, doctors' groups are warning that with less than 1% of the population fully vaccinated, the country remains in a precarious situation. Maria Limpin is the vice president of the Philippine College of Physicians.
Right now, there are some local government units that have stopped the vaccination program because there's no available vaccines anymore. There seems to be no effective programs to contain the pandemic. That is when we would probably expect seesaw of lockdowns and then release and then lockdown again.
But the lockdown has pushed the country's economy into a deep recession and triggered joblessness on a scale not seen since World War II. But when the government's social welfare response was found lacking, Philippine people power stepped up to fill the gaps. Manila resident Ana Patricia Non dragged a small bamboo cart onto her street corner and stocked it up with food staples. Above it, a sign, "Give what you can, take what you need." The sentiment struck a chord with the nation and donations began to flood in. But when a member of the government questioned if the initiative had ties to armed communism, Anna temporarily suspended it for fear of retribution. A UN report last year noted that some leftists, who've been red-tagged, as they call it here, were subsequently killed by masked gunmen.
Red tagging is a big deal here in the Philippines. If you're saying something against the government or you have opinions not aligning with the government, so you will be tagged as a communist. The goal is very sincere and very pure.
And what started as a single food bank has now evolved to hundreds of initiatives across the Philippines. I'm standing on the corner of the Malacanang presidential palace where President Rodrigo Duterte resides, and across the road from it is a long queue, around 200 people long at the moment and growing. They're waiting for food handouts from a community pantry that's been set up here. Speaking to people here, they say there aren't enough jobs at the moment and that government aid is in short supply.
Ayuda is cancelled.
Cancelled? You say the Ayuda is cancelled?
Yeah, the pumpkin.
But shortly before 2 p.m, it was abruptly shut down by the police after an order had been given to distribute the food through the local council. A group of women who'd been queuing since 10 a.m. said they are yet to receive Ayuda, financial aid from the government.
No Ayuda.
The government says it has distributed 75% of its financial aid program to Metro Manila. The handout is $21 per person. The hard lockdown is up for review in mid-May, and the government will then have to choose once more between prioritizing the economy or the overwhelmed healthcare system.
Howard Johnson reporting from Manila there on that second COVID surge and how it's affecting the economy, the people, healthcare, everything. Thank you for all your comments today. You've been getting onto Facebook and telling us what you think of Bill and Melinda Gates' news that they are divorcing after 27 years of marriage, how it might affect their charitable foundation. Kasim Paridi in New York says this: heartbreaking, truly sad indeed, so surprised. Another example how the insanely wealthy don't escape failures and disappointments in their private lives. I also hope this doesn't affect their generous charitable work. You can read more on that story by going to BBC World Service on Facebook and comment on other stories we've covered today here on Newsday. That's it from Lawrence and myself. We're back tomorrow. Take care.
You're listening to the BBC World Service. Jeff White and Jean Lee continue to investigate an international hacking scandal.
First, a huge company is hacked. Then their computers are wiped. The FBI steps in to investigate and accuses North Korea, who deny any involvement. It all sounds like a blockbuster movie, but this actually happened.
The Lazarus Heist, Sunday at 21:30 GMT. This is the BBC World Service, and on our website you can explore more of our programmes, from documentaries to science. Listen and download at any time by going to bbcworldservice.com. On air, online and on smartphone, this is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Coming up after the news, it's People Fixing the World with me, Nick Holland. This week, people who don't go looking for evidence, but listening for it instead, in places like this. It's a rainforest in Papua New Guinea. A few years ago, some scientists went to check out how healthy it was by analysing the sounds of the creatures in it.
We're breaking the soundscape down into the individual pieces that make the soundscape up. So it's like as if you were listening to an orchestra and you were trying to tease apart, oh, here is a violin and here is a cello, and kind of making sense of which animals are making the sounds.
It is giving us insights to these forests that we just didn't have before.
Find out how these forest sound detectives do it, and how the technique helped tribes of people trying to preserve these habitats they call home. That's all coming up after the BBC News.
BBC News, I'm John Shea. Rescue workers in Mexico City are combing through the wreckage of metro carriages after a railway overpass collapsed onto a busy road. At least 20 people have died, including some children, and almost 50 have been taken to hospital. From Mexico City, Will Grant reports.
Videos posted to social media show the collapsed overpass at Olivos station in Mexico City. The carriages and the bridge crumpled into a tangle of metal on the highway below. Firefighters and ambulance crews are working through the night as they attempt to reach the injured survivors. Those who have died will have most likely either been travelling on the late-night train or were directly beneath the overpass when it collapsed. The train was travelling on Line 12, the newest line on the system, which was only completed a few years ago. Mexico City has the second most used subway system in North America after New York and carries tens of millions of passengers a week. This is thought to be the worst incident on the system in 45 years.
Mexico's president has apologised to the indigenous Maya people for what he described as the terrible abuses they'd suffered since the Spanish conquest 500 years ago. Andrés Manuel López Obrador said their treatment had been shameful. Ministers from the G7 group of industrialised nations will meet in London today for their first face-to-face talks in more than 2 years. James Landale reports.
Foreign ministers from the G7, that's Britain, the US, Canada, France, Germany, Italy and Japan, will be joined by counterparts from Australia, South Korea, South Africa, Brunei and the EU. Today they'll discuss the world's big geopolitical issues, from China to Myanmar, Ethiopia to Ukraine, Syria to the Sahel. The underlying theme will be how they can best organise to defend international rules and open societies against the threat of autocratic regimes. And for Britain, the meeting's host, a big test to see if its global foreign policy can live up to its name.
The official number of coronavirus cases in India has topped 20 million. There's been no let-up in the rate of infections for a 13th day. Davina Gupta is in Delhi.
It's getting more and more difficult each day for thousands of families who are seeing their loved ones lost because they're not able to get the adequate medical aid even in major cities. And one of the most prominent crises of oxygen shortage remains, in fact, even prompting India's top court to intervene in India's capital, Delhi, where it asked Centre to ensure uninterrupted medical supply to hospitals. Just this morning, we've seen another SOS from a children's hospital asking for oxygen supply, claiming that they will be running out of it within 2 hours. And that's this desperate situation that we're seeing right now, despite the global aid coming in.
Our correspondent in Delhi, Davina Gupta. This is the latest world news from the BBC. The couple who founded the world's largest charitable foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates, have announced that they are to divorce after 27 years of marriage. In a joint statement, the pair said they would continue to work together for their organisation. Bill Gates, the co-founder and former chairman of Microsoft, is one of the world's richest men. The trial of Ghislaine Maxwell, who is accused of trafficking teenage girls for the financier Jeffrey Epstein, has been put back from July until the autumn, after her defence team asked for more time to prepare. A judge in New York said the postponement was appropriate because new charges were added to the case last month. Ms. Maxwell denies all the allegations against her and has pleaded not guilty. A leading international charity says almost 5,000 children displaced by the fighting in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia have been separated from their parents. Catherine Byorahanga is in Nairobi.
It's already very difficult to get aid and support to Tigray. And now what Save the Children is saying is that children really are facing the brunt of this. Many of them are turning up at informal camps. They don't have adult caregivers. And this means that it's very hard for them to get food, water and shelter. And on top of this, some children are living in single rooms with dozens of other people, including adults. Now this leaves them at risk of physical and even sexual violence.
Poland is easing its pandemic restrictions from today as its third coronavirus wave continues to lose momentum. Shopping centres and museums are reopening and primary school classes are resuming nationwide, although the number of pupils will be restricted. The government plans to ease other restrictions gradually throughout May if the infection rate continues to fall. It's been dropping sharply since hitting all-time highs a month ago. The government also plans to accelerate the vaccination rollout. BBC News.
Right. I'm just setting up this acoustic recorder.
In a rainforest, a team of scientists strap a small recording device to the trunk of a tree.
They've just got an SD card that we record all the data on, and at the bottom here is the microphone.
They're using it to capture the sounds of the forest. The clever part is what they do with the recordings they get.
Bioacoustics is this new exciting way to get information about wildlife by using the sounds that the animals make.
And they're using these sounds as a way to measure the health of the forest.
So almost as like when you go to the doctor, they listen to your chest with a stethoscope. And that's the same that we do with Rainforest. We listen to the vital signs by checking on everything that makes those beautiful rainforest sounds.
It is giving us insights to these forests that we just didn't have before.
In this programme, we'll find out how it works and how it's helped a tribe in Papua New Guinea having to strike a balance between their own needs and the needs of nature.
People fixing the world.
Hello and welcome to People Fixing the World from the BBC World Service. I'm Nick Holland. We're the programme that looks at solutions to problems facing the planet. This episode takes place inside a lush green rainforest region of Papua New Guinea. It's about tribes of people who, for hundreds of years, have made these forests their home. As little as 50 years ago, Some of them had had little or even no contact with the outside world. They're indigenous people who hunt and forage for food, using what the forest provides for their survival. The communities we'll hear about live in remote villages in the Adelbert Mountains. It's a 2-day trek just to get to them from the nearest road.
So you're on kind of trail to get to the village. You know, this sort of narrow, muddy path that goes up and down and up and down.
Someone who's been to visit them is Eddie Game, the lead scientist for an organisation called the Nature Conservancy. It's a non-profit organisation focused on preserving natural habitats.
You're walking through what you think is dense jungle, and 10 metres later you stumble out and there's little huts.
And then when we got to their village, they prepared a big feast for us.
Zuzana Burivalova was also on the trip. She's a tropical forest ecologist and an associate professor at Wisconsin University.
It was just an incredible privilege meeting people from these 3 communities.
And they're really sociable people, very, very, very keen to tell you their stories.
And one of their stories is the reason why Eddie and Susanna were there. The tribes needed to know whether they were living sustainably off the surrounding forests, or if their way of life was exhausting its natural resources. As we'll hear, Eddie and Susanna were hoping to find out, not by looking in the forest, but by listening to it instead. 20 years ago, the people in these tribes started to spot some worrying signs. Some of the fruits and animals they picked, hunted and ate were becoming harder and harder to find.
The older generation, they were coming out to say that resources have changed, the forest has changed. We have to go far to look for useful tree species to build our houses. Mothers have to go out further than previously to look for certain fruits in the forest.
This is Cosmas Apolis. He's from Papua New Guinea. In the 1990s, he was a forest conservation officer. He's been in close contact with these tribes for decades.
Also, wildlife, their population has dwindled down from when the older generation used to see them.
Presumably, if you're one of those communities that relies off the land, that's incredibly worrying.
Exactly, it's a matter of life and death.
One possible cause for this decline is that improvements in their health meant their populations steadily grew. And with more mouths to feed, more patches of forest needed to be cleared to grow more crops, and more animals were hunted. The loss of habitat meant resources once sustainably taken from the forest were no longer being replenished fast enough. So 20 years ago, the tribes, with the help of the Nature Conservancy, devised a solution they hoped would make a difference.
We went village by village, sitting down with them and discussing, how we could basically divide their land up into zones and use it more efficiently in a way that would allow more forest to remain there, essentially.
Rather than live off any part of the forest, as generations of their ancestors before them had done, they decided to restrict their activities to separate zones.
They dedicated parts of their forest for basically producing food, vegetables and yams and so on.
And that was a change to how things had been done in the past, because previously sort of each family would have got a part of the land, so you'd end up having little bits of farms, I guess you'd call them, scattered all over the forest. But instead now we have an agricultural zone.
And then other parts of their forest they dedicated for hunting.
An area where everyone's agreed they're going to hunt, and we'll all hunt there, and because we're not disturbing it by cutting down lots of trees to plant cassava and banana and things like that, hopefully there's more animals to hunt.
The reorganisation allowed them to dedicate large areas of land for perhaps the most important purpose.
They wanted to reserve part of their forest for just conservation, so that nothing would happen in that forest.
Essentially like a mini national park, something that they were setting aside, that they weren't hunting in, that they weren't cutting down to farm. That was their area to protect the forest and hopefully replenish the forests around them that they do hunt in.
The largest of the conservation zones covered an area of about 16 square kilometres. The hope was that they would have a regenerative effect across the tribe's forests. But what nobody was sure about was whether they'd be big enough to do that, or whether their protective benefits would be outweighed by the impact of the surrounding zones. As the years went by, the communities watched and waited. Eventually, they started to see signs of recovery.
They see animals coming back, like the cassowary, like the Victoria crown pigeon. They also look at other evidences like feathers, droppings, and also footprints.
Although this was undoubtedly good news, the sightings were only anecdotal. What was needed was solid evidence, especially as the authorities in Papua New Guinea were keen to extend what the tribes had done to other parts of the country.
We felt a bit uncomfortable basically agreeing to that without having good evidence that it was actually benefiting biodiversity.
But getting that evidence was proving almost impossible. There were just too many different creatures in the forest to check up on, especially over such vast areas. Previous attempts with experts on the ground trying to catalogue species were costly, taking too long, and incomplete. But then a clever new way of surveying environments began to emerge.
Bioacoustics is this new exciting way to get information about wildlife by using the sounds that the animals make. So rather than looking at where the animals might be, we're just listening and recording the sounds that they make.
And so we latched onto this idea of using acoustics to test whether there really were more species in forests that communities were looking after well.
That's why Eddie and Susanna had gone back to the villages. They were armed with this new technique, hoping it would give them the answers everyone was looking for.
To set up one of our recorders, we would set out from the village pretty early in the morning. So you have to kind of weave your way through the jungle, crossing branches and fallen trees.
Over the course of a couple of weeks, with members of the tribes showing them the way, they made trips to the different zones.
This was pretty exciting for us because this was really the first time we'd used acoustics in this way.
Some of what you'll hear are the recordings they made at the time.
So these guys are our guides, Mr. Anton, Fabian. We really wouldn't be able to do this work if it wasn't for these guys. We would be lost in about a minute in this forest.
In each zone, they set up small sound recording devices, 34 of them in total.
So these are the little units we used. They're really simple. They've just got an SD card that we record all the data on. And at the bottom here is the microphone.
It really looks just like a small box, maybe the size of a juice carton or a milk carton. So we strap them on a tree.
I don't even know how Susanna did this.
Do you need help?
Of course I need help.
Once it's set up, once we're confident it's recording okay, we do take some observations around, take some photos of where we are, but then, we walk away.
We'll be back with these rangers in a few days to pick it up. This is This is recording. We want to get a full 24-hour recording of the forest, so we hear it at each part of the day.
Most people assume, and I would have assumed, that actually the easiest way to go and see the health of any ecosystem is to actually go in and see it and look at it and go, oh, yeah, this looks all right.
It is counterintuitive, isn't it? You think, oh, we could go and we could just look. And there are a few problems with looking in the rainforests that have dogged our attempts to measure biodiversity and look at the impact of projects for a long time. And sort of chief among those are that most forests, especially tropical forests, are really thick and dense, and animals are very good at keeping away from us. And many of them are hard to see. They're kind of, we call them cryptic, and they're particularly hard to see when you're there.
A lot of animals are camouflaged as well, I guess. Some of them are incredibly small.
100%, yeah.
And I guess at night time you can't see anything anyway.
Yeah, so a sound recording can tell us about all the biodiversity that is vocal. And even though there's only a proportion of the biodiversity out there that's making noise that you can pick up, it's a much larger proportion than you would see either by walking through the forest or by counting animals visually or by surveying on a camera trap, and certainly a lot more than you would be able to detect by taking an image of the forest, say from a satellite or an aircraft.
In a rainforest packed with vegetation, the point of using microphones is they can hear further than a camera can see. And unlike a camera lens, they can hear in all directions. The audio paints not a landscape, but a soundscape of the creatures that are there.
Oh, it's incredible how much information, how much data you can get from, let's say, even just 1 hour of soundscapes in the rainforest. We can not only listen to the sounds that we recorded, but also we can then analyze it and get meaningful ecological information out of it.
What's clever is not only can they detect the obvious creatures on the tape that you can hear, but using computer software, they can pick up the ones you can't.
That's the really incredible thing about soundscapes, that you can listen to them, but you can also see the soundscapes. You can look and analyze the different frequencies. So let's say you have that really, really noisy parrot that's really close to the microphone, and it's kind of the main thing you hear. You can zoom in on the lower and the higher frequencies, and you can see, oh, there are actually also several different kinds of insects, and there is a frog making sounds at the really low frequencies.
What the computer software does is something the human ear can't. It singles out all the different bits of sound that make up a recording. It splits the sounds apart and draws clear computer images of them on a screen called a spectrogram. So you're literally sat at a computer looking at, what is it, a picture of the sounds?
We do literally start with a picture of a sound. So usually the first kind of analysis we're doing is a picture of a day in the life of a forest.
Can you actually spot say for example, where the birds are on that picture and where the frogs are, or can you sort of distinguish between the creatures?
Yeah, we can see frogs tend to call at fairly low frequencies, so they're down the bottom. Birds tend to be in a kind of distinct frequency band in the middle. Insects can call right across the frequency spectrum, and especially if you combine information on the time of the day that something's making noise and the frequency of it, you can get a pretty good sense of what type of animal it is.
We would take just 1 minute at a time and listen to it, and also look at the spectrogram and draw boxes around the individual animal calls, like a gibbon or a hornbill or so on. And once we have these species kind of boxed up, we can even feed them to machine learning algorithms that can help us analyze similar sounds in other minutes of the soundscape.
By doing this and comparing them to the known call patterns of different species, they could tick off a whole host of creatures. So long as they could hear them across all the recording sites, they could be confident their numbers were broadly healthy, without having to go and count them. Cleverly, what they could also do was compare the overall picture of the sounds they recorded to what they knew the sounds of an intact, untouched forest should be like. It's based on a theory about how animals have learned to communicate.
In a forest that has all the biodiversity that should be there, and it's been there for a long time, every animal has kind of worked out the way it's going to communicate, and that's led to it having its own unique sound signature. So it depends on this idea that basically animals have figured out over time to use sound signatures that are slightly different from each other and collectively fill up the soundscape.
Basically, they have to make sure that if one species of birds is making calls to attract mates or to communicate about food, it has to be making sounds at different frequencies. Otherwise, they might not be able to hear each other. And that's why in a species-rich rainforest, we will get a really rich soundscapes because the species have adapted over time to basically occupy different parts of the acoustic space.
And in a healthy forest, what we're looking for is that the frequencies are full, the bandwidths are taken up. From sort of low to high, you've got animals making noise. And we're working then on the belief that as gaps appear in the soundscape, that means there's species that should be there that are no longer there. And the gaps that you wouldn't necessarily pick up just by listening to the forest with your kind of naked ear there, but they're easy to see when you plot the sound out and look at it on a screen. And that's been a real revelation for me in my work, is seeing just how powerfully you can use soundscapes to detect changes in forest.
What they were hoping to see from the conservation zones was this complete orchestra of sound, one without gaps, that demonstrated the existence of a complete range of creatures across every part of the ecosystem, even the ones they couldn't identify because nobody had discovered them yet. What they saw from the recordings was encouraging.
I was really overwhelmed and impressed with how busy the soundscapes were.
It was rich, saturated sound, full of species. And so it told us, that the conservation areas that they had established really are different, materially different in terms of the biodiversity they have in the forest around them, and comparable to the most remote places that we were able to find in the Adelbert Mountains.
So that must have been pretty rewarding to think that actually the plan that you'd suggested to them 10, 15 years before was actually working.
Yeah, it was exciting, and with a decent amount of relief too, of course. But we were excited for them, excited for us, and we were scientists, so we were also kind of G'd up about how well the method of acoustics worked, because it was giving us insights to these forests that we just didn't have before.
For the tribes in the Adelbert Mountains, the results were reassurance that the decision they'd made 20 years ago to divide up their land was paying off.
In Papua New Guinea, we call our forest the supermarket, we call our forest the pharmacy, and we call our forest the bank, the food bank. If you have the land that's healthy and has all the big trees and has all the animals in it, then you are blessed.
bioacoustics are gradually being used to assess other impacts of human activity across many parts of the world. From logging to farming to building and beyond. It's a science that's still developing, and new ways of extracting and interpreting data from sounds are being developed. One idea is to create libraries of recordings from different parts of the world. One scientists can listen back to and reanalyze in years to come. That's it for this episode of People Fixing the World. If you want to get in touch, our email address is peoplefixingtheworld@bbc.co.uk. Next week, a clever but possibly controversial way to dispose of old oil rigs. Until then, goodbye.
Coming up next, it's Business Daily at 8 GMT.
Money, power, and a disappearance. It has all the makings of a thriller. Chinese billionaire Jack Ma disappeared from the public eye. Join me, Celia Hatton, where I ask, where is Jack Ma?
And in Discovery at 8:30 GMT, we ask, why do some noises make us cringe?
Those features also appear in fingernails down the blackboard. It's a high-pitched sound, but also your fingernails, because they judder as they go down the blackboard, they have this kind of temporal modulation, this kind of roughness, which is a bit similar to a scream.
At 9 GMT, it's the Arts Hour. Here's Nikki Beatty.
Actor Riz Ahmed on playing a drummer who goes deaf in Sound of Metal. Bollywood star Abhishek Bachchan talks about playing a morally flawed character. And there's music from Dua Lipa.
That's all still to come here on the BBC World Service.
Coming up on Business Daily with me, Rahul Tandon, as COVID cases continue to rise in India, we look at the impact on India's middle class. Could it force millions into poverty and slow down growth for a generation in one of the world's largest economies? That's all coming up after the very latest BBC headlines.
BBC News, I'm John Shea. Rescue workers in Mexico City are combing through the wreckage of metro carriages after a railway overpass collapsed onto a busy road. At least 20 people have died, including some children, and almost 50 have been taken to hospital. Foreign ministers from the G7 group of industrialised nations will meet in London today for their first face-to-face talks in more than 2 years. They're expected to discuss global developments, including the military coup in Myanmar. The official number of coronavirus cases in India has now topped 20 million. There's been no let-up in the rate of infections, with more than 300,000 positive tests recorded for a 13th day in a row. There are still reports of oxygen shortages in the capital, Delhi. The eastern state of Bihar has declared a 2-week lockdown. Poland is easing its pandemic restrictions from today, as the country's third coronavirus wave continues to lose momentum. Shopping centres and museums are reopening, and primary school classes are resuming nationwide, although the number of pupils will be restricted. The Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea has launched a nationwide coronavirus vaccination campaign in an effort to staunch a runaway outbreak of the disease. The Prime Minister said that the first 100,000 doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine had arrived in the country. Britain and India have agreed new trade and investment deals worth more than $1.3 billion. The deal is expected to create more than 6,000 jobs in the UK, mainly in the technology and health sectors. And the Madrid region in Spain is holding local elections today that will be dominated by the response to the pandemic. The Conservative People's Party has governed the region for the last 26 years, and the incumbent, Isabel Díaz Ayuso, appears to be heading for victory again. And that's the latest BBC World News.
Hello and welcome to Business Daily from the BBC World Service. Coming up, we look at how COVID has impacted India's middle class and hear from some of them who've lost their jobs.
Had suicidal thoughts, but being a single child, I couldn't take that step which I wanted to definitely that time, as I have my mom's responsibility on me and she's a senior citizen.
And as some predict a huge decline in India's middle class, we look at the long-term implications of India's second deadly wave of COVID.
I think these have set back India by about 2 decades. It's terrifying. You locked down brutally at a time when you didn't need to. You opened up when, cases were still rising.
That's all coming up here on Business Daily from the BBC. That is a sound that has become all too common in India. Distraught relatives mourning the death of another loved one as the cases of COVID continue to rise. Harjas is a volunteer at a temple giving free oxygen in New Delhi.
I'm speechless about this situation, what's going on, and how people are suffering. Their family members are dying in front of them in their hands just due to lack of infrastructure and lack of basic necessities, which is not available in hospitals. And it's a complete blunder, I must say, and no one should face such issues.
As we heard there, the Narendra Modi government has been criticized for not being better prepared. But a spokesperson for the ruling BJP, Narendra Taneja, said India's experience was similar to others.
Medical infrastructure is overwhelmed. We saw similar things in a city like New York, we saw in Italy, we saw in several other countries. In the West, the so-called developed West, we saw that. And it's not only the ordinary people. A judge of the Supreme Court of India, who is called in India, we call such people VIP, very important people. He died of COVID. So it's not only the ordinary people. When it comes to this, many people have lost their life.
Today here on Business Daily, we're going to be looking at the economic impact of COVID on one particular group of Indians. If you go to any Indian city or town, one of the things that will strike you is the huge number of cars on its roads. That is a sign of the increasing spending power of India's middle class, the group many credit with driving India's economic growth over the past decade. Depending on how you define the middle class, and of course there are many different methods used, they make up about 10 to 30% of India's 1.3 billion population. Whilst economists continue to argue over the exact numbers, what they can all agree on is that the group has grown rapidly since the liberalisation of India's economy in the early 1990s. Sandeep Roy is one of India's leading columnists, and he's based in Kolkata.
When I was growing up in socialist India, where excess was frowned upon, everyone pretended to be middle class. Some of us were middle class with air conditioners and color TVs and cars. Some were middle class and rode the bus to work every day. I think when India's market opened up to the world, the middle class suddenly also became a market, a driver of the economy. They were the people who were going to be the consumers of everything that was flooding the market. So in that first decade of the 2000s, everyone started talking about the middle class doubling in size, which basically meant people with sizable, disposable incomes had doubled. So it's a middle class that is defined by its consumption behavior. And in that sense, its size of growth has also become the yardstick against which to measure India's growth.
Sandeep, depending on the definition, a lot of people are using earning more than $10 a day in India as proof of being middle class. There are a lot of people in that group, aren't there?
Even now, middle class is so broad, it could cover a well-paid chauffeur and his employer, even though when he drops off his employer's family at some fancy restaurant, the meal they have probably costs more than his entire month's salary. But to me, middle class was more a state of mind than an income level. So it was a basic level of safety net, comfort, not worrying about your next meal or education. I think the effect of the pandemic and the lockdown has really made that safety net threadbare for many Indians in the middle class. People have lost jobs, have taken up jobs at half the pay. The merchant class has been hit hard.
Every country has its own traits of what it means to be middle class. What are those symbols in India, and are they changing?
An aunt who has raised her son on her own after my uncle died called the other day very proud that her son had bought her a car. But now, to me, the signifiers of middle class have expanded. It's holidays, but holidays abroad. using Western brands, how many times you eat out. But I think the greatest sign of middle class aspiration is the woman who works as a domestic help in 6 houses, but whose daughter wants to study engineering. The biggest challenge for India will be whether those people will be accommodated in the economy and be able to think of themselves as middle class, or whether they will fall between the cracks, finding jobs as perhaps Uber drivers or food delivery, jobs that don't match their aspirations.
We are once again in the middle of a surge in cases, and a complete lockdown is seen largely as an ineffective option. The pandemic and the lockdown have hurt India's middle class the most, according to a report by the Pew Research Centre. India's middle class shrunk.
Those cracks that Sandeep talked about have, of course, got wider during the pandemic, as they have in many countries. As we heard there, it's an issue that the Pew Research Group has been looking at. To date, they estimate that 32 million people have dropped out of India's middle class in the past year. Let's hear from one of them. Radhika lost her job in Mumbai in the city service sector when India went into lockdown in March last year.
My company actually just asked me to leave the job within a day. As per the appointment letter, they are supposed to give us 2 months' salary. I was totally shattered. They honestly paid me only for that 6 days, not even for that 1 month I worked for, saying we cannot afford the salary right now.
How has all this affected you emotionally? Because you have to look after your mother as well.
The grocery and the vegetable prices had increased that time at a very high level. I was almost, I can say, emotionally broken down completely, and I had suicidal thoughts. But being a single child, I couldn't take that step which I wanted to definitely that time, as I have my mom's responsibility on me and she's a senior citizen. So I had to actually keep smiling in front of her so that she does not feel the pain. And I didn't want her to know. I couldn't tell her. I had to keep myself smiling. But back of the mind, yes, there was always a fear that what if some emergency comes up. There were definitely sleepless nights, which has affected my health that time, and it is still affected me.
You finally found a job, but you're being paid a lot less than you were before. Your salary's half as much at around $200 a month. How are you coping?
I have recently got a job after struggling for 9 months. Again, I have to take up this job because something is better than nothing. Now the issue is I've started again with such a low salary. I don't know how many years it will take me more to come back to my normal salary. Again, what I have taken the money from my family and friends, that's again a debt. How will I repay them back? Because since I had a gap of 9 months, no bank is ready to give me a loan. What in between if I get a medical emergency for my mother or for myself also? Where will I go? How will I run? How will I manage?
That is a sound that you're hearing constantly in India's major cities. As the number of cases continues to rise and more people require treatment, it is women who are facing the biggest challenges in the workplace. Many are having to leave their jobs and businesses in India's deadlier second wave. Renu Shah runs Shakti, an organization that helps female entrepreneurs.
It is becoming very, very difficult for them to survive, so they have to either shut down their businesses or at least pause it for a while. Now, it automatically brings down the income of the family, and the people who are just making it to the middle class are facing a major brunt of this, and the chances are that they will slip out of the middle class and probably will have difficult time in the future. The ones especially who are working will have to either leave their jobs or pause their businesses because of the slowdown and devote a lot more time in caregiving and taking care of the household.
Renu, after the lockdown last year, India opened up again, but the schools have remained closed. And that's a problem for many women, isn't it? Because they're having to stay at home and look after the kids.
When mothers are able to send their children to school, so, they are free for those many hours and they're able to devote those hours to whatever else they are doing. And now children are studying at home, which means additional work for women.
We know that liquidity is an issue in India. Is it still harder for women to get loans that they'll need in these difficult times?
They have very little of family support. They have very few assets in their name. So because of which getting money from the market or taking loans from the bank becomes difficult. They don't have any collateral against which they can take the loan. Now, if you look at the second surge, they traditionally had problems with liquidity, and now they will also have a failed business. So I'm only trying to imagine what the situation will be when they go back to the banks or the funders to raise money after things have eased out. It's going to be like really difficult.
So with the apparent decline of India's middle class, are its streets going to see a lot less cars and maybe be a little bit quieter? Let's hear now from two of the leading economists when it comes to the world's largest democracy. Firstly, let's talk to Praveen Krishna. He's Professor of International Economics and Business at Johns Hopkins University. He's not convinced by the Pew Research's figures.
It would be very difficult to accurately estimate how many people have dropped out of the middle class. And the main reason for this is that the data necessary to make such a calculation are simply not available. There are some estimates out there, including by Pew Research, about around 32 million people or so who've dropped out of the middle class category. I wouldn't take those numbers too seriously. I think we can all agree that it has been a difficult economic circumstance for many, including those in the middle class, including the poor. Accurate estimation is probably going to have to wait a while.
You're not sure of the figures, but do you accept the criticism that the Indian government has not done enough to stimulate the economy and help the middle classes in the same way as, say, President Biden has done?
If you go back to April, May of last year, the government did announce a fairly substantial package, which took the form of food rations to the poor. Later in the year, the government announced a very substantial package to sort of essentially keep firms afloat, provide liquidity, loans of various sorts, credit to medium and small-scale enterprises and so forth, that all added up to a very substantial amount. And I believe the number was 20 trillion rupees, which is about 10% of GDP. I imagine that if the second wave continues, the government will undoubtedly be thinking of ways in which to do more. So overall, I think they've been good in terms of the scale of the program.
There's a lot of negativity around at the moment, but are you optimistic that we will see India moving forward economically again as it comes out of COVID?
I believe that India will bounce back. The Indian economy has actually been the beneficiary, but in a certain sense, of a number of important structural reforms that have been implemented in India, including the GST reform, including reforms having to do with labor markets, having to do with the educational system, that in the short run may have cost the system a bit, but I have no doubt that many of these changes are for the good. And so once we get past this, and I hope it's not going to be very long for us to get past COVID, I have no doubt that the Indian economy will do well and will be able to bounce back.
So Professor Mishra is optimistic, a rare voice of light in the gloom that surrounds India at the moment. But not everyone agrees with those views. One of them is Professor Jayati Ghosh, an Indian-born economist who's currently teaching at the University of Massachusetts. She thinks the numbers who have left the Indian middle class are much higher than the Pew estimates.
I think it's an underestimate. I think there will be many more million people. It depends how you define the middle class, but many observers had said that the middle class in India is now about 150, 200 million people. I believe that the period before the pandemic and then the pandemic itself have so decimated regular employment in what we would call formal work that it would have shrunk to about half of its former size.
But do you not agree with Professor Mishra that the government's done all it can to protect jobs in India? It's made sure that the country hasn't gone into lockdown again to try and protect the economy.
It's terrifying. I do believe that the past few years, the policies of the government, and I emphasize it's not just the pandemic, it is the government's policies, both before the pandemic and in response to the pandemic. I think these have set back India by about 2 decades. It's terrifying. You locked down brutally at a time when you didn't need to. You opened up when, cases were still rising. You got complacent and you actually bragged about how you had conquered the disease at a time when new mutant varieties had already arrived, and you allowed it to spread. And in fact, yourself as a government, the rulers organized super spreader events.
Let's look forward. It's a difficult situation. What needs to happen now to tackle the economic and the health problems that India is facing?
That requires a massive vaccination program. They should have issued compulsory licenses for vaccines to many more companies before this. They've done it only now, but they have to speed up this process. They should now import vaccines, give up the fiction of being the supplier to the world, import as many as possible. They should actually go for a major vaccination program that will protect as many people as possible as soon as possible. But the control of the disease also requires that state governments be financially empowered. They are all bleeding. They've all been deprived of incomes and denied even their own dues from the central government over the past 2 years. This needs to stop. They must be immediately provided with much more resources, direct resources, not borrowing, by the central government, simply to combat this disease.
With many states now imposing lockdowns, it may be some time before India's roads are busy again. In the meantime, the Indian government will try and balance the lives of 1.3 billion people against their livelihoods. The signing of a huge trade deal with Britain on Monday will go down well with the country's middle class. But with no end in sight to rising cases of COVID, it's a rare piece of good news. That is it for this edition of Business Daily. Remember to tune in tomorrow when Justin Rowlett will be asking whether the global car market is on the cusp of its biggest transformation since the introduction of the Model T by Ford.
when she's showering.
Case 2, the International Police Chief.
September 2018. Meng Hongwei had worked his way up through the ranks of the Communist Party and was working in France, in the lofty position as head of Interpol, the international police agency. On a visit back to China, he texts his wife an emoji of a knife, a signal he was in trouble. He, too, goes into a secret prison. Interpol admits it doesn't know what happened to its leader.
Case 3, the Angry Billionaire.
March 2020. Ren Zhiqiang, a real estate mogul nicknamed the Cannon for his willingness to criticize China's leaders, fires off an angry memo in the midst of China's COVID outbreak. He makes a not-so-veiled reference to China's president, Xi Jinping, calling him a clown. Ren then vanishes.
It might sound hyperbolic, but I think in reality what we have seen is truly no one is safe.
Michael Castor is the editor of The People's Republic of the Disappeared and a human rights advocate.
The state created a variety of systems to detain people in secret, often facing serious abuse, that continued for years. The total number was escalating, and there was very little real consequences. China continued to be highly integrated in trade and economics around the world. So the more that China was able to get away with this type of gross human rights violation of individuals that are small, the more it became emboldened to do so at higher and higher level individuals.
The beautiful movie star, the international police chief, the disgruntled billionaire. When he lists them off, they start to sound like characters from that board game, Cluedo. But then there's a case that, for me, is much closer to home.
My name is Cheng Lei. I'm a TV anchor based in Beijing, China, and this is my story.
Last summer, fellow journalist and Australian citizen Cheng Lei, who's a well-known face on Chinese state TV, disappeared. Lei is someone I know, or knew. We have kids the same age. We used to chat at weekend barbecues in Beijing. All of a sudden, a real person, not an easy caricature, was suddenly added to the list of China's most famous missing people. Michael Castor again.
What we see in those cases in particular is when you threaten the dominance, whether it's on social media, television, music, other forms of entertainment, anything that could be seen as challenging what the party wants you to see and hear. Those people then, if they don't fall in line quickly, are at risk of disappearing for a period of thought correction, realigning your mentality with the party line. The red line really is the party line.
All those cases have moved on. Fan Bingbing re-emerged after several months, chastened and apologetic. Meng Hongwei, the police chief, was sentenced to more than 13 years in prison for bribery. Ren Zhiqiang, the Cannon, eventually got an 18-year sentence for corruption. And Cheng Lei? Well, in February, she was formally charged with leaking state secrets. It's a murky accusation, and the government's own laws mean we probably won't learn much more about her case. Lei hasn't been allowed to see a lawyer, and of course, no contact with her 2 kids. Their family spokesperson says they don't understand what's happened to their mom. And frankly, neither does anyone else outside the government. So, where does Jack Ma fit into all of this? Well, the world knew something wasn't quite right when the billionaire failed to turn up to the finale of his own apprentice-style reality TV show in Africa.
Don't worry about competitors. Let the competitors worry about you. And
the rumor mill went into overdrive. He wasn't seen for nearly 3 months until, in January this year, in what's been called a proof-of-life video, Jack Ma appears from an unknown location. Lingling Wei, China correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, has been at the center of investigations into Jack Ma's downfall.
In contrast to his usual style, he appeared humbled during that video and talked about helping rural teachers, kind of tried to appear more charitable and adhering to government agendas and all that. You can tell that he is keeping a low profile, in my view, both by choice and from the inklings he got from the authorities.
So we're fairly sure Ma hasn't gone into formal detention, but he's definitely had his wings clipped. And it appears, at least in part, to be related to that infamous speech he gave just before the share listing of Ant Financial. Shortly after, what was set to be the world's biggest IPO was abruptly cancelled by the Chinese government. Rue Ma is a leading authority on Chinese tech companies.
Basically, there is this annual very high-level summit called the Bund Summit in Shanghai. And Jack spoke on, I believe, the first day, and then he gave this 20-minute speech that he launched into effectively this tirade about the Chinese banking system. So the central message he had to this audience of, by the way, largely banking sector regulators was that China's banking system was really old-fashioned and really needed an overhaul. And the exact metaphor he used was that China was taking its lead from Western systems that were basically built for quote-unquote old people, and China is more like a youth, and this was the wrong medicine for the Chinese economy. And then he also called out China's banks for having a pawn shop mentality and not being able to keep up with the times, and that China doesn't have systemic risk, which is what, these banking regulations were supposed to account for.
And so Jack's calls for even looser rules had regulators worried and had moved way beyond simple online payments into the world of easy credit, giving consumers access to money that China's traditional banks had never given them before. Some started to worry that the money was flowing too easily, risking massive debts.
A lot of people in China looked at what happened in the West and was like, we don't want that to ever happen to us. And we want our banks, our credit risks to be very, very tightly regulated. So we'd rather err on the side of conservatism.
It's interesting because, I lived in China for a long time. One of the complaints among my friends, or ordinary people or people who I knew were trying to start businesses was that they couldn't do what was possible in the West. They couldn't go to your neighborhood bank, ask for a small loan or get a mortgage very easily or go do those things. And when I was kind of watching them, start using things like Alipay, it solved a lot of problems at first for a lot of people. It made payments so much easier. They could get small loans. It kind of started this credit system that just didn't exist in China before. Is it just that Jack was basically wanting to let things go even further and for money to slosh around even more in China?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think there's public sentiment and then there's the reality, right? So what I would say the reality is that, like you said, Ant was very much solving a lot of these actual problems, right? Credit card penetration in China was very low. It's very difficult for a bank or like a system that as kind of antiquated as China's banking system was 10 years ago to extend personal